Picture this. You're 7 years old. No phone, no school bell, no cartoons. Just dirt, sunlight, and a to-do list that would make a grown adult cry. Welcome to childhood, ancient edition. A time when go play outside wasn't a suggestion. It was survival training. We like to imagine ancient kids running around carefree, chasing chickens, laughing under olive trees. And sure, that happened sometimes, but most ancient childhoods were less innocent adventure and more unpaid internship with occasional mortal danger. Let's talk about what these kids actually did all day, because the answer is way stranger, way sadder, and honestly way more impressive than anything you did at that age. First, we need to talk about surviving infancy, because in the ancient world, just being born was already the hardest part of your day. Historians estimate that in many ancient societies, somewhere between a third and half of all children didn't make it to age 10. Let that sink in for a second. Before a kid could even learn to walk properly, the odds were already stacked against them. Disease, malnutrition, infections from something as small as a scraped knee, any of it could be fatal because there was no such thing as antibiotics, no vaccines, nothing. So the first job of an ancient child was simply this: don't die. And parents knew it. In ancient Rome, newborns weren't even considered fully part of the family until a specific ceremony, sometimes over a week after birth, because infant mortality was so brutally common that parents braced themselves emotionally before fully attaching. In some regions, babies weren't even named right away for the same reason. Imagine that, an entire culture quietly preparing itself for loss before celebrating life. Now, once a kid actually made it past those terrifying early years, things didn't exactly get relaxing. Around age 6 or 7, ancient childhood hit a wall that modern kids never have to face. Work. Real work. Not chores, not clean your room. Actual labor that kept households and economies running. In ancient Egypt, kids as young as 5 were already helping around the home, fetching water, feeding animals, and by 7 or 8, many were working fields alongside parents or learning a trade. If your dad was a potter, guess what you were doing at age 8? Shaping clay pots. If your mom wove textiles, you were pulling thread until your fingers ached. There was no, when I grow up, you were already becoming what your parents were in real time, with zero say in the matter. Mesopotamian children weren't spared either. Clay tablets from ancient Sumer, yes, actual homework from 4,000 years ago, show us that scribe school existed, and it was brutal. Kids started around age 7, sat in something called the tablet house, and spent hours copying cuneiform symbols over and over until their hands cramped. And if they messed up, teachers weren't shy about corporal punishment. One surviving tablet is basically a kid complaining about getting smacked for bad handwriting, which honestly is the most relatable ancient document ever discovered. Some things never change. Kids have been hating school since school was literally invented. But here's where it gets interesting, because not every ancient society treated childhood the same way, and the differences are wild. Take ancient Sparta. If you were a boy born there, your childhood was essentially a horror movie with a fitness plan. At age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and enrolled in a state-run training program called the agagi. This wasn't school in any normal sense. It was designed to strip away comfort entirely. Kids were underfed on purpose, forced to steal food to supplement their diet, and if they got caught stealing, they were punished. Not for stealing, but for getting caught. Think about that logic for a second. They were trained to be sneaky, tough, and emotionally hardened, because the entire point was to produce soldiers, not children. Bare feet in winter, one thin cloak year-round, and mock combat that sometimes resulted in real injuries. Spartan mothers were famously said to tell their sons to come back from battle with your shield or on it, meaning victorious or dead, but never fleeing. That's the energy Spartan childhood ran on. Athens, right next door, geographically close but culturally worlds apart, treated boyhood very differently. Athenian boys from wealthier. Families actually got what we'd recognize as an education: reading, writing, music, and physical training, but with way less sleep in the wilderness and hunt with your bare hands energy. They studied poetry, learned to play instruments like the lyre, and practiced public speaking because in a society built on debate and democracy, being persuasive was basically a superpower. Meanwhile, poorer Athenian boys usually skipped the intellectual stuff entirely and went straight into apprenticeships or farm labor because philosophy doesn't feed a family. And notice a pattern already? Boys. We keep talking about boys, and that's not an accident. It's the uncomfortable truth of ancient childhood. Because if you were a girl in most ancient civilizations, your childhood looked completely different and usually dramatically shorter. In ancient Greece, girls typically didn't go to school at all. Their education happened at home, and it was entirely focused on preparing them to run a household. Weaving, cooking, managing enslaved workers if the family had any, and above all, preparing for marriage. And by preparing for marriage, we don't mean someday in the vague future. Greek girls were often married off around age 12 to 15, sometimes to men twice or three times their age. Childhood for many ancient girls functionally ended the moment puberty hit because that was considered the starting gun for adulthood. Rome had a similar pattern, though slightly more flexible depending on class. Roman girls from wealthier families might get some basic education, reading, writing, maybe some Greek, but this stopped abruptly once marriage arrangements began, which again could happen shockingly early. Legal marriage age for Roman girls was 12, and while marriages weren't always consummated immediately at that age, the paperwork side of adulthood started terrifyingly fast. Okay, let's lighten the mood for a second, because ancient childhood wasn't only fieldwork, weaving, and being handed off into marriage. Kids still found ways to be kids, and honestly, some of what they did for fun holds up remarkably well. Archaeologists have dug up toys from basically every ancient civilization, and it turns out kids across the entire ancient world were obsessed with some surprisingly familiar stuff. Dolls, for one. Egyptian children played with wooden paddle dolls, and Roman kids had dolls made of wood, clay, or even ivory for the wealthier families, complete with tiny jointed limbs so the dolls could sit or walk. Some Roman dolls found in children's graves even had miniature jewelry and clothing, suggesting kids treated them exactly the way modern kids treat action figures or dolls today. Full personalities, full outfits, probably full imaginary drama. Then there's the universal favorite, the yo-yo. Yes, actual yo-yos found in ancient Greek pottery paintings dating back over 2,000 years, made from terracotta, wood, or metal. Some historians believe the yo-yo might be one of the oldest toys in human history, second only to dolls. So next time you see someone doing yo-yo tricks, remember, ancient Greek kids were doing that same thing under the Parthenon. Board games were massive too. In ancient Egypt, there was a game called senet, played on a grid board with pieces moved based on throwing sticks or bones like dice. It was so popular it wasn't just for kids. Adults played obsessively too, and senet boards have even been found buried alongside pharaohs because apparently you needed entertainment in the afterlife. In Rome, kids and adults alike played a strategy game called Ludus Latrunculorum, which was basically an ancient version of chess crossed with checkers, all about trapping your opponent's pieces. And here's a fun one, knucklebones. Kids across Greece, Rome, and beyond used actual sheep or goat ankle bones as both dice and jacks style toss games. You'd flick them in the air, catch them on the back of your hand, or use them for gambling style games predicting which side would land up. It sounds a little grim using animal bones as toys, but honestly, it's not that different from kids today using random household objects as makeshift games when they're bored. Ancient kids were just working with what they had, and what they had was bones. Sports and physical games were everywhere too, especially for boys. Wrestling, foot races, ball games. Roman kids played something called harpastum, a rough, physical ball game that historians think might be a distant ancestor to rugby, minus any of the modern safety rules, obviously. Greek boys trained in the gymnasium from a young age, which wasn't just fitness, it doubled as social bonding and even a kind of informal networking for future political or business relationships. Imagine your entire adult social circle being decided by who you wrestled with as a preteen. Now let's talk about something that made ancient childhood genuinely dark, and that's the fact that in many ancient societies, an enormous number of children weren't free at all. They were enslaved. In ancient Rome, enslaved children were incredibly common, and their childhoods were essentially erased the moment they were born into slavery or captured. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. There was no growing up in the way we understand it. A 6 or 7-year-old enslaved child in a Roman household might already be doing domestic labor, running errands, or serving wealthy families at dinner parties. There are even records of enslaved children being specifically trained for entertainment purposes. Dancing, performing, or serving as companions for wealthy children their own age, which meant one child got a childhood while the other, right next to them, didn't get one at all. Same age, same room, completely different reality. This is honestly one of the most uncomfortable truths about ancient childhood. It wasn't universal. There wasn't one single ancient childhood experience. There was the childhood of the wealthy, learning music and rhetoric in shaded courtyards, and there was the childhood of the enslaved or the poor, working from sunrise until exhaustion with no education and often no rights at all. The gap between these two childhoods happening in the exact same city, at the exact same time, was often massive. Let's swing over to ancient China for a moment, because Confucian values shaped childhood there in a completely distinct way. Respect for elders, discipline, and education were deeply emphasized, especially for boys in wealthier families who were expected to study Confucian texts from a young age in preparation for potential government service through imperial examinations later in life. This wasn't casual studying either. It involved memorizing massive amounts of classical text, often starting around age 6 or 7, with strict tutors and long hours. Meanwhile, girls in ancient China were generally trained at home in domestic skills, and depending on the era and region, some practices like foot binding, which technically began later historically than the earliest ancient periods, but became deeply significant in Chinese childhood over time, physically altered a girl's entire future mobility, starting the process painfully young. Over in ancient Mesoamerica, among the Maya, childhood had its own fascinating rhythm. Maya parents were reportedly quite affectionate, based on surviving artwork and figurines showing parents playing with or carrying children. But Maya kids also faced intense physical practices tied to beauty standards, like having boards pressed against an infant's skull to create an elongated head shape, which was considered beautiful and status signaling in Maya culture. Crossed eyes were also considered attractive, and some accounts suggest small beads were sometimes dangled in front of a baby's face, specifically to encourage that cross-eyed look. Beauty standards, it turns out, have always been a little intense. We've just changed the methods. Maya children also worked from a young age, helping with agriculture, particularly corn cultivation, since maize was central to their entire civilization, both practically and spiritually. Play still existed, though. Archaeologists have found small clay whistles, rattles, and figurines believed to be toys, some shaped like animals, suggesting Maya kids also had their version of stuffed animals, just made of fired clay instead of cotton and polyester. Let's go back to a topic we touched on earlier but need to sit with a bit longer, because it's one of the most jarring parts of ancient childhood: how insanely early people were expected to become adults. In most ancient societies, there wasn't really a concept of teenager the way we understand it today. That entire in-between life stage barely existed. You were a child, and then very suddenly you were an adult with adult responsibilities, adult marriages, and adult expectations. Coming of age. Ceremonies marked this transition, and they happened way earlier than most of us would be comfortable with today. In Rome, boys had a ceremony called the toga virilis, where around age 14 to 16, a boy would formally exchange his childhood toga for the toga of a Roman citizen, essentially declaring to the world, "I'm an adult now." From that point forward, he could vote, do business, and take on legal responsibilities. 14 years old, and suddenly, you're navigating Roman civic life like a functioning adult. For girls, as we mentioned, marriage itself often served as that coming-of-age marker, and it arrived even earlier. There wasn't a gentle transition period to figure out who you were. Childhood essentially had an expiration date, and it expired fast. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Despite all this hardship, ancient parents clearly loved their kids deeply in ways that show up again and again in the archaeological and written record. We have surviving letters from Egyptian and Roman parents expressing grief over lost children that are heartbreakingly similar to how anyone today would express loss. There are children's graves found with toys carefully placed inside. Favorite dolls, tiny jointed figures, small clay animals. Physical proof that even in societies where child mortality was heartbreakingly common, parents still deeply cherished their kids and wanted to send them into the next life with something familiar and comforting. There's a particularly touching example from ancient Rome. Inscriptions on children's tombstones describing them in loving detail, sometimes noting little personality quirks like being especially playful or affectionate, written by parents who clearly wanted the world to remember their child as more than just a name and a date. Grief, it turns out, hasn't changed much in a few thousand years either. Let's talk food for a second, because a huge chunk of an ancient kid's day revolved around simply helping get food on the table. In farming communities across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and rural Rome and Greece, children were expected to help with agricultural tasks as soon as they were physically capable. Scaring birds away from crops, helping harvest grain, tending animals like goats or chickens, and fetching water, sometimes from wells or rivers quite far from home. Fetching water alone could eat up hours of a child's day, especially for girls, who in many ancient cultures were specifically tasked with water collection alongside their mothers. Cooking was another major task handed to children early, especially girls. Grinding grain by hand using stone tools was physically exhausting and time-consuming, and it was frequently a job given to young girls as training for eventually running their own households. Bread was a dietary staple across most ancient civilizations, and someone had to grind that flour, and that someone was very often a child. Let's shift to religion for a moment, because spiritual life absorbed a surprising amount of an ancient child's day too. In many ancient cultures, kids were brought into religious rituals from a young age, whether that meant helping prepare offerings, attending temple festivals, or in some cases being given specific ceremonial roles because of their perceived purity or innocence. In ancient Rome, young girls chosen to become Vestal virgins. Priestesses tasked with tending Rome's sacred fire were selected as early as age 6 to 10, and then committed to service for 30 years. 30 years, starting from childhood, dedicated entirely to a religious role, with strict rules and severe punishment if those rules were broken. Talk about childhood ending fast. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, children participated in various religious festivals throughout the year and even had protective amulets specifically designed for kids, often featuring the god Bez, a household protector deity associated specifically with guarding children and mothers during childbirth. Egyptian parents were clearly anxious about child safety, and they built entire religious practices around trying to protect their kids from harm, disease, and evil spirits. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how physically tough ancient childhood was, in ways that go beyond labor and into pure environment. No modern medicine meant that childhood illnesses we consider minor annoyances today, measles, dysentery, even bad tooth infections, could be fatal. Dental health especially was rough. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletal remains regularly find evidence of severe tooth decay and abscesses in children, sometimes from diets high in grain that wore down teeth, or sugary foods like honey among wealthier families who could afford it. There were no dentists, no pain relief beyond herbal remedies, meaning a toothache could be a genuinely agonizing, prolonged experience for a kid with zero modern intervention available. And let's not forget clothing and physical comfort in general. Most ancient children, especially from poorer families, went barefoot, wore simple tunics regardless of weather, and had far less protection from the elements than we're used to today. Winters were endured, not comfortably managed. Summers were baked through, not air-conditioned away. Every single day involved a level of physical toughness that would be genuinely shocking to most modern kids. Now let's circle back to something lighter, because despite everything, storytelling and imagination were massive parts of ancient childhood too. Long before books were widely accessible, oral storytelling was how ancient kids learned about their world, their gods, their history, and their moral values. Grandparents and parents would tell epic stories by firelight, tales of gods, heroes, monsters, and warnings dressed up as entertainment. In Greece, kids grew up hearing about Hercules, Perseus, and the Trojan War long before they could read a single word. Absorbing these stories the way modern kids absorb superhero movies, complete with favorite characters and imaginative reenactments during playtime. Kids across ancient cultures also loved imitative play, essentially ancient role play, acting out adult activities like hunting, warfare, or marketplace trading using sticks as swords or clay figures as characters. Archaeologists have found miniature clay chariots, tiny wooden weapons, and mini pottery sets, all believed to be play items letting kids imitate the adult world around them in a smaller, safer format. It's honestly the exact same instinct behind modern kids playing house or playing pretend battles. Some behaviors are just baked into childhood itself, no matter the century. Here's something wild to think about. Many games archaeologists have uncovered from ancient sites have essentially survived in some evolved form into the modern day. Marbles, for instance, existed in various forms across Rome, Egypt, and the ancient Near East using clay or stone spheres. Hopscotch-like games are believed to have Roman origins, originally used as training exercises for soldiers before kids adapted the concept into a simple hopping game using patterns etched into stone or dirt. So the next time you see kids playing hopscotch on a sidewalk, know that you're technically watching a 2,000-year-old military training exercise that got repurposed by bored children. Let's talk briefly about siblings and family structure, because ancient households often looked dramatically different from the small nuclear families common today. Extended family living arrangements were the norm. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins frequently lived together or nearby, meaning ancient kids grew up in busy, crowded, multi-generational households. Older siblings were often expected to help raise younger ones, meaning a 9 or 10-year-old might already have real caregiving responsibilities for a toddler sibling while parents worked. Childcare in many ancient households was simply distributed across whoever was available, cousins included. Discipline, unfortunately, tended to be strict and physical across most ancient civilizations, without much of the gentler parenting philosophy we associate with modern approaches. Educational settings especially had zero-tolerance policies enforced through physical punishment, and this wasn't controversial at the time. It was simply how education functioned almost everywhere, from Mesopotamian scribe schools to Roman classrooms. Speaking of Roman classrooms, let's paint a clearer picture of what an actual school day looked like for a Roman boy lucky enough to receive formal education. Classes typically started early, sometimes before sunrise, using lamps for light since natural sunlight wasn't up yet. Students memorized texts, practiced writing on wax tablets using a stylus, which could be erased and reused, and recited lessons aloud, often through repetition, until concepts were fully drilled into memory. There were no desks in rows like we imagine today. Students often sat on simple stools, sometimes even outdoors under a covered walkway, weather permitting. Teachers, called literator for basic education, were often not particularly well respected professionally despite the importance of their job, and discipline was strict, sometimes brutally so, with rods or straps used to enforce compliance. For a Roman girl fortunate enough to get any education, lessons were typically shorter-lived, ending once she reached marriageable age, at which point education gave way entirely to domestic training. Wealthy Roman girls might learn reading, writing, some math for household management, and music, but rarely progressed into the advanced rhetorical training reserved specifically for boys destined for public or political life. Let's take a broader step back and ask an important question. Why does any of this matter today? Why should we care what ancient kids did all day? Because understanding ancient childhood gives us this incredible, humbling perspective on human resilience. These weren't miniature adults living miserable, joyless existences every single second. They were still kids, finding joy in yo-yos made of clay, laughing over board games with their friends, forming imaginary worlds using sticks and figurines, all while carrying responsibilities that would overwhelm most modern adults, let alone children. There's something deeply human about that contrast. Hardship and joy coexisting, work and play intertwined, childhood adapted to survive whatever era it was born into. Every civilization we've talked about today, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, China, the Maya, approached childhood differently, shaped by their environment, their economy, their religion, and their values. But across every single one of these vastly different cultures, spanning thousands of miles and thousands of years, certain things remained strikingly consistent. Kids wanted to play, parents wanted to protect their children, and childhood, however brief or demanding, still held moments of genuine warmth and connection. So next time you're bored, sitting comfortably with instant food, climate control, and endless entertainment at your fingertips, maybe spare a thought for that 7-year-old Sumerian kid getting smacked for messy handwriting, or that Spartan boy stealing food just to survive his own upbringing, or that Egyptian girl grinding grain for hours before the sun even fully rose. Their entire world required a level of endurance most of us will thankfully never have to test. Ancient childhood wasn't a single story. It was thousands of different stories, harsh in some places, surprisingly playful in others, and almost always shaped by forces completely outside a child's control. But through toys buried in tombs, letters expressing grief, and games that somehow survived into our modern playgrounds, we get this rare, intimate glimpse into lives lived thousands of years ago by people who, despite everything, were still just trying to be kids. And honestly, given everything they went through, maybe we owe today's yo-yo champions and hopscotch players a little more respect. They're carrying on a tradition that's older than most of the ruins we visit on vacation.